I've never, I haven't been, I never went to attended a university, so I graduated colonial in 2005. 2005. That's all.
The Broad would like to acknowledge and recognize the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples, who are traditional caretakers of the land where our museum sits. Indigenous peoples have called this land home for thousands of years, and they are its present and future caretakers. Hello, everyone. I'm Joanne Heiler, founding director, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's talk, part of the Broad's ongoing Unprivate Collections series of conversations between collection artists and cultural luminaries. Today, I'm so pleased to be welcoming William Kentridge and Claudia Rankine, award-winning author and playwright and co-founder of the Racial Imaginary Institute. Today's conversation coincides with our landmark exhibition, William Kentridge in Praise of Shadows, which opened just yesterday. Surveying 35 years of Kentridge's art, this interactive, transformative show includes 130 works and is curated by Ed Shad of the Broad. After talking to many, many visitors yesterday, I think I can confidently say it's proving to be revelatory and provocative to all who've seen it. And I hope you all will see it very soon. And if you are inspired to do so, fresh after today's talk, note that the museum is open till 6 p.m. today, and your ticket to this event will get you into the show. We are also going to be free admission every Thursday evening during the run of the show, starting this week. The Broad Collection has followed Kentridge's work for over 2 decades. 18 collection works, including major installations, joined the loaned works on display in the show that just opened. William's stunningly varied practice is rooted physically in Johannesburg, South Africa. Intellectually, it centers in an abiding skepticism of ideologies and forced allegiances to single viewpoints, most especially the power dynamics and long violent legacy of colonialism. His art seeks to explore the edges and uncertainties of a South Africa in transition from an oppressive apartheid-era society to an imperfect and challenging democracy. With every artist we present at the Broad, we encourage dialogue. Kentridge has worked in a prolifically collaborative spirit across disciplines, including with dancers, writers, composers, musicians, philosophers. I could go on, artists of all sorts. So that means we've had a truly distinctive opportunity to create a collaborative and open approach around this exhibition. Today's talk is the debut of our live programming, and we will go on from here to present a really exciting schedule. Next week is the international theatrical debut of the durational performance of Houseboy by Ferdinand Oyono, which will run from November 17th to the 20th. Right across the street at the Roy and Edna Disney Cal Arts Theater, otherwise known as Red Cat, co-located in Disney Hall. Directed by Kentridge and performed by the experimental organization Center for the Less Good Idea, the play is co-presented with the Broad and supported by Marian Goodman Gallery and Brenda Potter. Other upcoming programs will include collaborations with Dr. Rael Gero-Sally and the Space for Creative Black Imagination, which is part of the Maryland Institute College of Art, with artist and abolitionist Patrice Cullors, who will present a newly commissioned work made in response to the show, with poet Shonda Buchanan, who will organize a series of readings titled When We Dream in Bittersweet Tongues, engaging the effects of cultural values on storytelling, on history, and on language. And with artist and musician Lazaro Arvizu Jr., who will present a 2-part series, Speaking Gabrielino, presenting the Tongva language and exploring disappearing languages as an outcome of colonialism. About all of this and more, you can check out thebroad.org. And I want to say that in addition to those planned programs, we also simply encourage spontaneous exchanges of ideas in our galleries every day for every visitor, between our welcoming staff who are informed and educated about the work on view, and every single person who comes in the door who wishes to engage. I want to thank our leading partner, East West Bank, who are a big part of supporting our community outreach and public programs like this one today. Now, just a bit more about our speakers. For decades, William Kentridge has anchored his studio practice in charcoal drawing from an associative and improvisational handling of images on paper into film, sculpture, opera, theater performances, printmaking, and many other mediums. Kentridge's work has been seen in museums and galleries around the world since the 1990s, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Louvre in Paris, Whitechapel Gallery and the Royal Academy in London, and many more. His opera productions include Mozart's The Magic Flute, Shostakovich's The Nose, and Alban Berg's operas Lulu and Wozzeck. Kentridge's theatrical productions include Waiting for the Sibyl and, of course, Houseboy, which I mentioned earlier. He's the co-founder of the Center for the Less Good Idea, an interdisciplinary incubator space for artists based in Johannesburg. I'm pleased to say that the other co-founder of the center, artist Bronwyn Lace, is here with us today. Claudia Rankine is a tenured professor of the creative writing program at New York University and is one of the most celebrated artists of our time. To quote a recent Financial Times profile, "It's the way her work straddles the boundaries between poetry and prose, intimacy and alienation, private and public, scholarly and lyrical informal invention that makes her such an incisive thinker about the intricate dynamics of race." She's the author of 5 books of poetry, including Citizen, An American Lyric, and Don't Let Me Be Lonely, An American Lyric, 3 plays, including Help, which premiered in March of 2020 at the Shed in New York, and The White Card, which premiered in February 2018. Her recent collection of essays, Just Us, An American Conversation, was published also in 2020. She is the co-editor of several anthologies, including The Racial Imaginary, Writers on Race and the Life of the Mind. In 2016, Rankine co-founded the Racial Imaginary Institute. Just a few of her awards and honors are the Bobbitt National Prize for Poetry, the Poet and Writers Jackson Poetry Prize, as well as fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. A former chancellor of the American Academy of American Poets, she lives in New York. One more note, the conversation right now is being live streamed, so hello to our on-screen audience out there. And it also will be posted as a recording at a later date on our website. Also, there'll be an opportunity for our live audience here to raise questions at the end of the program as part of a Q&A. And it is now my very distinct pleasure to bring onto the stage William Kentridge and Claudia Rankine. Thank you.
Good evening, or afternoon. Afternoon. It's very dark out there. It's such an honor to be here. I feel like I won the lottery. and I did win the lottery. So did you start by seeing a film? Yes. So we thought that we would begin the evening with a little performance, which we are going to begin immediately, William.
This I was informed of 5 minutes ago.
5 minutes ago.
Not my idea.
But very adept and capable of anything, as we know. I wanted to start here because I feel as if William Kentridge has spent his entire career making this come true.
Okay. So we are inside the cave of Plato. I'm playing the role of Socrates, and Claudia's given herself the easier role of Glaucon.
The more appropriate.
There are people sitting on the ground, their heads pointed in one direction, chained behind, looking at a low wall and people walking behind the wall, carrying objects, and there's a fire that casts the shadows of these carriers onto the wall opposite the prisoners. Plato. And do you see, I said, men passing along the wall carrying all sorts of vessels and statues and figures of animals made of wood and stone and various materials, which appear over the wall. Some of them are talking and some of them are silent.
You have shown me a strange image, and they are strange prisoners.
Like ourselves, I replied, and they see only their own shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave.
True. How could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads?
And of the objects which are being carried in like manner, they would only see the shadows?
Yes.
And if they were able to converse with one another, would they not suppose that they were naming what was actually before them?
Very true.
And suppose further that the prison had an echo which came from the other side. Would they not be sure to fancy, when one of the passers-by spoke, that the voice which they heard came from the passing shadow?
No question.
To them, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images.
That is certain.
And now look again, and see what will naturally follow if the prisoners are released and disabused of their error. At first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck round and walk and look towards the light, he will suffer sharp pains. The glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which in his former state he had seen the shadows. And then conceive of one saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion, but that now, when he is approaching nearer to being and his eye is turned towards more real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not fancy that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him?
Far truer.
And if he is compelled to look straight at the light, will he not have a pain in his eyes, which will make him turn away to take in the objects of vision which he can see, and which he will conceive to be in reality clearer than the things which are now being shown to him?
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's so... I'm sure we'll come back to it, but it's so interesting to remember that the categories of the prison, of the compulsion, of being forced to look in one direction.
I wanted us to start there because for me, I threw it on the floor because you threw it on the floor. Now you picked yours up. And now what's happening here? Is it fair for me to say that it's a sort of poetics for you in terms of a journey?
It is, but with this important caveat, that I'd worked in theatre, and I was making, in the theatre as one of its languages, which I was shown by the puppeteers I was working with, how to make shadow puppets. And I started making shadow puppets and made a film using the shadow puppets. And when that was done, remembered reading Plato's Allegory at university in first year philosophy. And then went back and reread it very carefully, and then understood the work was very connected to it. But it's not something, I didn't start with Plato and then make the images.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But the idea of enlightenment versus non-enlightenment, the idea of trying to...
I mean, that became it became clear that it was such a central metaphor. I mean, the allegory of Plato, or the metaphor of the movement from darkness into light being that towards knowledge. And it becomes, as you know, the kind of the metaphor of colonialism. We're going to go and bring enlightenment to the dark continent, take people out of their benighted state and bring them into light. And so all the cracks in the allegory are kind of come back and haunt us later when we understand the underbelly of the Enlightenment, which is colonialism.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I'm going to go all the way back and try and make my way forward, if that's okay.
That's fine.
And I'm going to begin with 3 or 4 longish questions, so I hope you can bear with me, in order to build some historical and familial history. So you were born in 1955 in Johannesburg, and you had the great luck of being the child of lawyer Sir Sidney and Lady Felicia Kentridge in a South Africa that by 1948 legalized, organized, concretized the brutality of racial discrimination and segregation against the black majority population with an all-white government. I know we know this, but just in case we don't, there it is. During your first 6 years, your dad numbered among a team of lawyers defending Nelson and Winnie Mandela, among others, in what was known as the treason trial, lasting from 1956 to 1961. You have said you had a comfortable suburban life, which suggests a fortress of trees. But how did the shape of everything that was occurring imprint itself on you during those formative years, helping to create a mythology of images for you?
Well, to start with the treason trial, which, as you said, was from when I was 6 to when I was, from when I was 3 to when I was 6. My father would go off to Pretoria, about 30 miles from Johannesburg, every day where the trial was being held, and come back. And so there was this phrase of the treason trial, but the most I could make of it was 2 things. One was, at the bottom of the garden, there were a lot of tall trees. Pine trees we had. And every day we would also have tea on our veranda, and on the veranda there was a small mosaicked table, which we would call the tile table. And in my head I put those things together, and for me it was the trees at the bottom of the garden and the tiles of the table to make the treason tile. We were at the treason tile. And I kept wondering, if my father was just going to the treason tile, why was he not in the garden or on the veranda? And so that became a kind of a key thing. But it's interesting looking back at it now, in terms of what is it that we have inside us that will take whatever clues there are and try to feel there has to be a meaning, a sense in them, and to put those things together. Later on, in terms of, so I'm not sure that trees came from there, but certainly my interest in trees now has that in the back of my head. But when I was 5 or 6, there was in the middle of the treason trial, there was the Sharpeville massacre. This was when 69, a crowd of people were protesting the restrictive pass laws, where people had to carry a pass, black people had to carry a pass to move around the country, and there was a protest, and the police opened fire, and 69 people were killed. And there was an inquest into this, and my father represented the families of those killed. But the point of the story was, in terms of the imaginary, was once at the age of 5, going into his study. He'd work in the evening every night in his study. When he wasn't there, it was during the day. And there was a yellow box on his desk, and I thought, oh, this is completely a box of chocolates. And so, knowing I was doing what I shouldn't do, I opened the box to take out a chocolate. But in fact, it wasn't a box of chocolates, it was a Kodak box of glossy 8x10 photos of all the people who had been shot. And the shock to a 6-year-old of seeing these images, I mean, compounded by guilt already, opening the box, and the double guilt of seeing images which I should not have seen, was very, very profound, in saying, this is what the world is. This is shocking. You know about violence between kids on the playground. You hit someone, he hits you. But adults doing this to other adults. What was the world if this could be how it operates? And much later that came into drawings, but 50 years later. It was some years later, I did one public conversation with my father. It was for an exhibition about the history of apartheid, which had both references to his work and to films. And I told the story, which he'd heard before, of doing it. But he said something interesting. He said, I know the story, but here's a chance, something I've never done. He said, I've never apologized to you for allowing those images to be seen by a 5-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very strong time.
Yeah, to leave it. It was everywhere. But you're still, I do feel like it must have been extraordinary to be a child in that household, because your mother was also very politically active. She started a clinic to give legal advice to people.
She did later on. At that stage, she was an advocate, but as a woman advocate in South Africa, her practice was very much restricted to what was seen as women's lawyers' work, which was divorce. Mm-hmm. And it was only when she'd kind of had enough of that, she decided the only way to actually function was to invent her own role and her own institutions, which she did first at the university and then starting a public interest law firm, mm-hmm. Which was so very much connected to what it was to be a woman lawyer at the time. But it was both completely natural. This was the family life around which you lived. But it became, one was aware of its anomaly in school, which was obviously an all-white, and in South Africa, all-boys school. This, formal, like an English school, uniforms, caps, all of that. And in there was a gap between how the world appeared to a lot of the other boys in the class, in which the racial laws and restrictions and separations were seen as natural and appropriate, and the couple of boys for whom in the class it was an evil that was very clear and palpable and spoken about in the house. So there was a kind of a separation from accepting the nostrums of a society as right from quite a young age.
By the mid-70s, 1976, the year of the Soweto uprising, you had graduated from university with a degree in politics and African studies. And between 1976 and 1978, you attend the Bill Ainsley Studio, a racially integrated art studio. That must have been unusual, but I'll finish my question, which ultimately becomes the Johannesburg Art Foundation. And you also, in the same year, co-found Johannesburg Junction Avenue Theater Company. And at the time you wrote to a friend, I also think I am now ready for some good etching work. One of the things I am good at is quick, first-time, write or throw it away work. And etching rather than pulling will be a way of working from this strength. And out of that comes Domestic Scenes, a series of 54 etchings created when you were 24 years old. You credit this period of printmaking as helping to shape your thinking, your studio practice, and conceptual approach. The prints themselves are an overt attempt to grapple with the hierarchical society you live in by depicting domestic service in South Africa. You have said the world of these etchings are not so different 40 years later. This work was in conversation with your play In the Kitchen, which you performed at your Junction Avenue Theater. Does the cross-pollination begin here between disciplines, a play informing the etchings, the images ultimately informing the films, a chain of intertextual production?
Yep, so the play, The Kitchen in the Kitchens, was a play I wrote and made with people from the theatre company, Junction Avenue. And its conceit was very simple. There was a maid working for her madam. The maid wants to go on holiday. The madam says she can't. The only way she can do it is to persuade her boyfriend to put on her uniform and be the maid. And of course, the farce is that the madam doesn't notice it. And in different ways out. But what it did also in that heightened form, which theatre is, mm-hmm. was to allow the paradoxes and the contradictions of that circumstances to be played with, both theoretically, but also in terms of gesture of serving, in terms of gesture of not seeing, of invisibility. Mm-hmm. And so when the etchings were being done, there was this whole kind of vocabulary or rich series of images which had come from the theatre, and the theatre had obviously come from the real world around in Johannesburg, but then went through the change into the theatre and then the change into the etchings, which were done as quick notes, one sort of plate a day for several months to arrive at the different images, which now, 40 years later, I'm kind of pleased with when I see them.
Great, good. How was the play received when you did it?
It was in small theatres.
Mm-hmm.
It was two things. It was played in small theatres, and then we also took a lot there were different programs for domestic servants around, different church groups, teaching cooking, teaching sewing, different skills. And we linked up with some of those organizations and did performances in community halls.
And
I would love to say there was a raucous and immediate response. There's a lot of laughter at the jokes and the pratfalls. But
who was in the audience?
It would be a mixture. In the theatre, it would have been an audience fairly similar to that. In the community halls, it would have been domestics who are off and out.
Well, when you say that, what are you saying?
Well, I'm saying people who are, I'm sorry, just the front of the rows that I can see. People who are more likely to have servants than be servants.
Okay.
Which is my assumption in a university setting is the context.
So then white people?
White people, it was always at the Market Theatre, which had mixed audiences, but I would say for that, primarily a white audience in those theatres, primarily a black audience in the community halls where we played.
So you have a play that says to white people, look, you don't even see your servants. You don't even know when one exchanges for another. And they come, and what they get from it is humor, but not recognition or recognition?
No, I'm sure moments of recognition.
Okay.
But I think it's not difficult for people to both say, oh, I recognize myself, and be untouched by it a few minutes later. There are moments of recognition. There are moments of awkwardness, of feeling, oh my God, is that us really? Is that how we would be? But also, I'm sure that people say, oh, we would absolutely know if somebody else was in our maid's uniform. We're not that blind. So in the literal sense.
Yeah, it's not me. Yeah. That's not me. Yeah. All right, so then after that, you become unhappy with your painting, your printmaking, your filmmaking. And in 1981 to 1982, you attend, how do you say, Jacques Lecoq?
Yeah, that's right, Jacques Lecoq.
International School of Theatre. And you also get married that year to the physician, Anne Stanwyck. Can you speak to your need back then to be physically involved in the making of things as an actor, to literally want to bring your body to your work? Was there an intuitive knowledge that as a member of a white minority, you would have to show up as a cognizant and present in order to bring the full history of your maleness and your whiteness forward, since so much of what was occurring politically had to do with maintaining the supremacy of those attributes? Sitting here, as one of your biggest fans, I ask this, fully aware of your prodigious genius and spectacular history. So I'm not saying
No.
that,
There are two different questions there that I would say. The one about going to theatre, I was doing both theatre and making visual arts in my studio before I went to Paris. And then I was told by friends, you need to do one thing. If you're going to make drawings, just make drawings. If you're going to be in theatre, do both. But if you just do theatre. If you try to do both, you're on a hiding to nothing. You'll be a jack of all trades. It's not possible. And I thought, this is very good advice. Okay, so I sold my etching press. I closed the studio, and I thought, I am now an actor. I will be an actor. And I went to theatre school and discovered after 3 weeks I was not an actor. And failed at that, but learned a lot in this class, in the year, about directing, about impulse, about energy, about the body. And then came back and had some time in the film industry, which was very depressing. And then found in the end, I was reduced in the end to being an artist. I was back in the studio, nothing to be done. And so that was kind of the trajectory, the harder question, or the bigger question of what did that mean about the performance of whiteness, the performance of being who one is. never struck me in such direct terms, but what was very clear, and this was very clear, in fact, very clear in Paris. In Paris, where I was with people who were similar age, 25, I couldn't believe how relaxed the other students were about what their lives were going to be. They might stay on, they might travel for 6 months, they would see what happened. Whereas for me, from before then, there was a kind of panic about how do you justify who you are. You have to do something to show. Partly it's about you have to show your father, you have a very successful father, there's a pressure to show you're not just a useless. But being white in South Africa, it felt very clear you were in a position, you were in a life of privilege. Without doing anything, everything was presented to you. Jobs would be easy, university would be easy, all of these things. And so there was a real danger that you just become a parasite. You just receive it all and do it. And so there was a very clear sense of you have to justify yourself in some way. You have to, not that you then have to necessarily be an activist, and that was part of it, but you can't just float. If you're going to be in the law, you have to really work hard at it. There's a kind of an impulse to having knuckled down and do what it was you were doing, whether it was art or theatre or law was secondary. And I think that was partly a knowledge of understanding, certainly at university in South Africa, I would think to some extent here, where even if you pay your fee, you know that the bulk of your education is paid for by the state. And we know that the state gets its money in South Africa very clearly from the taxes, which are the taxes on the labor power, the labor work of all the miners, of everybody around the country. So there's a very, not abstract debt, there's in one sense a very particular debt to everybody on whose backs your privilege rests. And so it wouldn't manifest itself as a guilt about that, but it would manifest itself as a kind of demand on yourself to do something, to not be lazy, to acknowledge the debt you owed. Mm-hmm. It's a long answer, sorry.
Well, it's what makes your work unique, I think, the consciousness of that positioning and the deliberate attempt to reckon with it, which I don't think I can think of many people in this country who I can turn that on. So I wanted to move from this bigger framework into some questions. You know, I was put in charge of the clock, but I have no idea what's happening, so, okay. I'm just gonna go until someone says stop. I wanted to turn a little bit to some of the formal aspects of your work. And in all the reading, there's so much great stuff written about you and the various shows. And in one, you talked a little bit about being vexed about how to depict crowds. And I want to bring it up now because I think it's the same issue. It's like, how do you stay accountable to the community you're coming out of? And so then it turns into a tangible question of how do I depict crowds within these drawings? So do you want to talk about that a little bit? How you ended up solving that and what helped you?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing just to point out here is there's a double element to your question. The one is responsibility to a community, and the second was how were the crowds drawn? And the first question, what is one's relation to all the people around, which was a question. How does one work with mass organizations? How does one work with a sense of not being alone in the world, of these huge people around? Is there as a real question? But then it comes into the studio, and as you say, in the studio, it becomes a very different question. It's as if within the confines of the studio, there's, not to say that those questions disappear, but they get pushed to the side and they get transformed into a series of formal questions, such as, do you draw a crowd of people that is simply approaching you? And you can do that, but then the people that you're seeing are always the same, just coming towards you. Whereas if you're drawing a lateral procession, then as someone appears on the screen, it's a new person, you can multiply. There can be a multiplicity, a huge crowd of people that one is watching. So the idea of a lateral movement, that was an important discovery. And of course, as soon as you've got the lateral movement of people or shadows, we're back with Plato. And in a way, like the people that you can see on the screen behind, carrying their objects moving on this procession, they're a bit like the figures in Plato's cave. And so one of the questions of the metaphor for Plato is, who are all the performers that are needed for this allegory to even work? It's an allegory about the prisoners looking at them. It's not an allegory about the people who spend their lives carrying these objects for the allegory to operate. So it became to be kind of people behind that question was the crowd. But it also became a question of one would work with silhouette, with exaggerated silhouette, with objects that could be carried and seen in shadows. So the laterality of it and the freedom that it gave one, either working with drawings or with projections, became central. And each time I do a procession, I think, oh my God, this is another procession. And people I'm working with say, do you really think you could do another procession? Haven't you kind of reached saturation? But they're wonderful to do. They're wonderful to do with all the other, all the collaborators, the performers, musicians that are there. And one always does a repetition in the hope that there'll be something new that emerges from that circle again.
Mm-hmm. And also, I like the fact that it brings everybody into the room.
Yeah.
Because there is a way in which you could be the only one in the room, and nobody would object to that. But except for me, I might.
I mean, there's a kind of sine curve in the studio of the pleasure of working with many people, and we do a lot of workshops. In January, we start a workshop which will have 40 people in the studio: actors, dancers, musicians, a range of people, and that's kind of heady and wonderful. Mm-hmm. And after that, it's also a real pleasure to be absolutely alone, just with a piece of charcoal and a piece of paper. So temperamentally, both of those are important for me.
And the other thing that becomes sort of in the studio important to you is just drawing. And I love that the films, we're in LA, we're talking about films, but the films for you are drawn films. You work with the Bolex, the 60mm Bolex movie camera. And you refer to your process as Stone Age filmmaking, and said that the idea was you would see a drawing itself. I love that, a drawing. And I know what you mean from seeing your, obviously seeing your work. When that was done, this is a quote, when that was done, I thought, well, I could continue with that process. In other words, I wouldn't have to stop when the drawing was finished. The drawing through film could continue almost indefinitely. I really just wanted to see a drawing continually making itself, marking, erasing, eventually changing itself, marking, erasing, eventually changing into different images. I wasn't thinking animation. I was thinking of it as drawing.
Yes, I mean, the starting point for most movie making, particularly here in Los Angeles, would be to start with a concept, a script, a storyboard, a treatment, all the things which you're writing about it rather than actually making the film. And at a certain point I realized if I wanted to make feature films, which every 20-year-old does, everybody has a script in their drawer. I had scripts in my drawer. And I realized at a certain point I would spend my life jumping through other people's hoops, trying to get their enthusiasm and their support before I was actually able to practice the métier. But if I was just doing drawings, then all I needed was a roll of film, which cost a few dollars at that stage, a piece of paper and some charcoal, and I could start working immediately without anyone else's buy or leave. Because I was working alone, I didn't even have to explain to anyone else what the story would be, because I didn't know what it would be. I knew an image I wanted, but the medium itself allowed for this uncertainty, for allowing yourself to be led by the image, to see what it was you were doing or making rather than knowing it in advance. And some people are very good writers, they're novelists, or they're script writers, and their way of thinking is to write the script. For me, I was completely hamstrung with that. It needed the physical activity of drawing for images to suggest themselves, which might come before or after the particular image I was drawing, which would become the film.
The drawings for projections, 1989, 2003, were my first interaction with your work. I was in my 30s teaching at Barnard, Columbia, in New York, and I saw this work. I actually thought, who is this black guy? Because the work was so sensitive to racial issues. And then I actually made a request from Miriam Goodman Gallery to allow me to show the films in my class, and they very kindly said yes. But I was surprised to read that when David Elliott, the curator at the Museum of Modern Art in Oxford, wanted to exhibit the films, you were somewhat insulted, thinking the drawings were art but not film. I had studied poetry and was interested in ways to return to the lyrical landscape, to return the lyrical landscapes to its reality. I was seeking examples of work that sacrificed nothing, not beauty, not history, not human limitations, not love, not violence. And so when I saw your work, I was like, whoa, here is the model I've been waiting for. This open field of connective tissue that could live in the questions and the seeing. And you said this was an art of ambiguity, contradictions, uncompleted gestures, and uncertain endings. The constant evolution through erasure in drawings for projection loosened the borders around the fixity of meaning and feeling for me. The truth of something didn't exist in the facts, but in the environment. Charcoal dust, smuts, dirty fingers, sooty particles, and in the process rubbings, the smudgings. Every moment could be high and low, this and that. It was a stunning moment for me in the development of my own practice as a writer, so thank you. And I'm glad I have the opportunity to thank you. So thank the Broad. Thank you. Thank you. Do you remember, because the characters Soho, Eckstein, and Felix Teitelbaum show up in these, and do you remember the dream where they arrived?
Yep. When I started these films, I was as Claudia said, I was interested in following the trajectory of a drawing. So you start with a blank sheet of paper, you shoot a frame. You do your first charcoal mark, you shoot another frame. You walk backwards and forwards between the camera and the drawing. And then when you project the drawing, you see, as is very common now with speeded up stop frame, seeing buildings being built, you see the drawing coming into being. And then it could continue. That was the way they began, but what came with them were things that I hadn't expected, such as the messy trace behind the charcoal. And that I was very apologetic about. I thought, oh, that's a mistake. I should do a perfect erasure, and kept apologizing to people for the bad erasures in the drawings. Until at a certain point, someone said, for goodness sake, the erasures are fine, stop complaining. And in the same way, when David Elliott said he wanted to show some of my films in an exhibition, I was the most conservative. I said, no, you can't put a video on an exhibition. Exhibitions have drawings and paintings. This was in the late 1980s. I was really behind the times. I thought a canvas painting or maybe a drawing was fine, but a film not. But eventually he put them on, and I thought, well, that's an embarrassment. But again, when people said to me, no, we really liked your film in the exhibition. You liked the film in the exhibition? I said, yeah. And then it was, oh, okay, let's recalibrate. Yeah, films in exhibitions, great, that's fine. So there's a sense of being led by the work. Mm-hmm. Good? We're being told in 5 minutes
okay,
we have
5
questions.
minutes? Okay.
In 5 minutes, yeah.
All right, let me, Okay, this is a quick question.
Yep.
The story of witness, I feel like in many of your, the work, there is a character who is watching something.
Okay, so you were asking about Soho Eckstein and Felix Teitelbaum. I'm sorry about the dream. I'm sorry to go back to that. So when I started these films, I needed someone to draw. And then I remembered a dream diary that I used to keep. from some months before. And there was one dream which I remembered, and it was so vivid I made a note. And the dream consisted of a group photograph, a photograph of men in front of a building, like a standard big group photograph. But the caption was what I remembered and wrote down on a drawing that I made of at that time, which was Soho Eckstein with 120 artists and photographers that have spent 12 days recording Johannesburg, the second greatest city after Paris. It's a kind of an absurd title. And so from that, I thought, okay, we've got this character that came from the dream. So if I'd known I was going to be stuck with these characters for 35 years, I'd have taken more care. But because they were kind of a given, and Felix Teitelbaum also came with a phrase. He was a character. It was, Felix Teitelbaum's anxiety flooded half of Central Park.
Huh.
So those are enough to say, all right, that's a starting point. Let's just see where they lead, rather than...
Did you wake up and write this all down?
I did those.
You did?
Okay. It was a period when I was keeping a dream diary, and they were both such bizarre phrases that those phrases were. So there is a physical notebook with those and a drawing.
Tide Table is one of my favorite pieces. I saw it at the Metropolitan in the middle of the day when nobody else was there, so I was free to weep, and I did weep. But I also felt myself in the position of the witness, of somebody who was witnessing the devastation of AIDS in Africa and having much frustration about the distribution of drugs in that country at the time and the role of the United States in the suppression, Clinton in the suppression of that distribution. So do you think of the men in these films as a witness, or, I mean, they're both implicated and witnesses?
I mean, there are themes that come out like that witnessing, which I was certainly not thinking about while making it, but which is there when the film is finished. Because you're very busy with individual particular scenes. I wanted the man sitting on the beach, as we can see here with his newspapers, and him being observed from afar, which are those three generals on top of the hotel balcony. But it's also the hotel where my father would have had his childhood on the beach. The man in a pinstripe suit in a deck chair is based on a photo of my grandfather who would go to the beach with his three-piece suit and sit on the beach like that. The boy in the sand is both my father from a family photo, but also my memory of myself with the woman who looked after me and my sister when we were children, Ellen Tole, black servant who looked after us. And the boy on the sand throwing the stone is based on, I asked my son, who was then 7 or 8, to throw a stone so I could film that to see the actual movement of it. So it's also a kind of a strange family history, but that's not to say it stops a whole series of other things being present when it's finished.
Exactly. And my final question has to do with monuments. They started that image in Monument, one of the first early films that transformed, and then the movement of the body of the black man in that. We have had so many discussions. I'm in Berlin now, so I'm in a place where one thinks always you can't walk down the street without encountering a stumbling stone. And on the stone it says so-and-so lived here, was killed in Auschwitz, was killed here or there. So the question of monuments is addressed in your work. And I just wondered, you started the Center for the Less Good. How do you imagine monuments functioning in the future? What would be your imagined ideal version of a monument?
I suppose the ideal version of a monument is a monument which keeps the questions of that monument alive. So there was a question in Paris. They had African art from Africa. First it was in an ethnographic museum. Then they decided, no, it needs to be seen for the beautiful aesthetics of it, and it was put to the Louvre. Then they opened the Quai Branly, and they said, no, this art doesn't make any sense if you don't explain all its cultural context. So it was taken from there to Quai Branly, where you feel, oh, it's going to get swallowed by its context, and you'll stop actually seeing it. So it was in a strange way, when the art was in its ambulance, as one might think, in movement between those two institutions. For me, it was at its most alive. And if you could have known that, it was forever going backwards and forwards. When those statues the statues are coming down, in the moment when they're lifted off their bases and they're in the air, they kind of have a power that sets all the questions about them in motion. When they're put in a dark storage and they disappear, in a way the question after a while disappears. If you keep an empty plinth, then you keep the question alive. I mean, there can be so many different solutions to what to do with history, which one can't say should just lord it over us in the same way unquestioningly, but which we can't pretend wasn't there. So maybe you take Churchill off his high plinth in London and you dig a hole and he's half height, so you can see him. So you know he's there, you know he's important. You know it's a question about why is that plinth empty and he's there. And to find different, in Belgium they had a statue of King Leopold, and on the bottom below the plinth were all the grateful Africans with their hands thanking King Leopold. And some wise artist came and simply chopped off the hands of the people below, which made them into the stubs, which was what was done to the people in the Congo when they didn't reach their quota for the rubber. So I think there are different ways but when it gets too stabilized, then it loses it becomes invisible again in a way.
Well, you have your nose on the horse.
And that's a kind of anti-monument.
Yeah.
What is the least powerful horse you could make to make an equestrian statue? And the difficulty was that whatever it is, even if it's just these few sticks, there's a kind of elegance of a horse. And there's the stupid magnification of a person on a horse. If you see every equestrian statue, I mean, if you just have a statue of a person sitting, it's not very impressive, even if you put them on a plinth. But if you put them on a horse, they're not only, I mean, firstly they go high, but secondly they kind of, their spine straightens and they have a sense of looking out and they take on the attributes of the horse as if that is inside them as well. So there's a strange way in which equestrian statues play with all of those questions of power, of illusions of power.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank
That
you.
was a treat.
Before we open questions to the audience, I just want to make a plug for William Kentridge in Praise of Shadows. Much is being discussed in this book and shown. So if you want more, without having to sit in these chairs, I would suggest you get this book. But now we're going to open out to you. And the format is that you will tell me a question, I will repeat it. So make it concise, because my memory, and we will continue receiving. So who would like to go first? Oh, there's one here. Yes. Hello. Okay, thank you. The question is, William, why and when did you stop keeping a dream diary? And Claudia, do you keep one? I don't keep one. I love sleeping. I don't want anything to interrupt that.
There was a period in which I was seeing a therapist, and I realized that the night before I had therapy, I would always have a dream. I would always remember my dreams. And I realized, no, this is stupid. This is like being a child that has to bring an apple to teacher every day. This is being able to bring a dream to the therapy session, to have something concrete to talk about. I said, oh, God, then I won't have to complain. Let's talk about the dream and I can stop the complaints. So it could have been in that time, but it was a relatively short time. I dream a lot. If I go back to sleep sort of at 5 and I can sleep from 5 to 7, then I always tell Anne in the bed, I say, now I'm off to the movies.
That's lovely.
Can you talk about Catalan Soviet constructionist influence?
Can you talk about, what was the first thing? Tatl and
the
Soviet.
Yes, I think that, there was, when I was at art school, when I was a student in the 70s, there was a sense of art history that went through the pre-impressionists, the impressionists, the post-impressionists, the fauves, the expressionists, into Matisse, and then jumped across the Atlantic towards American painting at the time of the Second World War, and then became abstract expressionism, and then New York Color School, field of painting. Jules Zelitzky was kind of God when I was an art student. And being in South Africa, where I thought this is impossible for the studio to only be about questions of formality, of surface and edge, what are other strands of modernism that kept connection, both didn't become academic, didn't become conservative or reactionary, but that still kept a connection to the world they were in? And the constructivists was one solution, the German expressionists, the Neue Sachlichkeit, Max Beckmann, and then examples going further backwards, like Goya, obviously. So that was my interest, in the initial interest, which has continued in their formal inventions. There was also something about what is the energy that the artists got from their belief in the transformation of society they were part of at the time, in the first years after the Soviet Revolution. Then it obviously went very sour, but there was an extraordinary flowering of optimism and artistic development at that time.
Back there?
Your parents, as lawyers, were very engaged in body politic. I wonder if you had discussions with them as a young artist about this sort of second-degree criticality.
I have to say it. I know you heard it. Your parents, now I've gone and forgotten it. Your parents, as lawyers,
Were involved with the body politic.
were involved with the body politic. Did you have discussions with them about the critical?
No, there's an interesting, they were both lawyers. A lot of the cases my father did were very important political cases, but they would both have described themselves as lawyers, not as activists. And there were other lawyers that saw themselves primarily as activists, and law was their instrument of their activity. And so there's a real question as which of the ones served both their clients and the bigger questions further. And certainly in my house, my parents' view was their dedication to their métier was the way in which they would most help particular clients that came to them. And so they didn't ever have a sense of, oh, how is this going to transform society? Your connection and your debt to society was a kind of given. It was within what you were doing. How did you do that in its most full way? But they never really talked about it. My father's always quite skeptical of this art business. He would say, when I was saying, I'm going to do a production of Wozzeck using puppets, he would say, well, I'm not saying it's not possible to do a production of Wozzeck using puppets. I'm just wondering why it's necessary.
As your career grew internationally, did you ever feel a bout of loneliness or feel like giving up as a representative of your story and South African history?
As your career grew internationally, did you ever feel a kind of loneliness and a desire to give up as a kind of representative of South African history?
I think a lot of artists at 4 a.m. all want to give up. It all seems a bad idea. But after an hour in the studio actually working, there's a sense of this is where I have to be. So it's never really appeared as a big question. It's not the same as saying one isn't in a panic about particular projects or feeling a whole direction is going badly.
But you have said, I have read that you have said that you feel as if you're carrying the burden of that history along with the making of the work.
Yes, there's that. There are different ways. There was a short period just when South African art started to be seen in the world, when mine had a very big place in that what was seen. And that felt a kind of unnecessary burden, because I thought, I can't speak on behalf of everyone. I'm not the South African spokesman. I can speak of the particular viewpoint from which I'm showing and where it comes from. And so when other South African artists, black and white, were being shown, it was a big relief to feel that, okay, people don't have to say, we're going to get the whole, you get a view of South Africa, but a partial view in the work. And that was a relief when many other artists' work was also being shown.
And you've also, I'm coming back to you, but you've also said that people have pointed out that the work could be seen, maybe one person pointed out, that the work could be seen as anti-Semitic, and that might account for why you have put yourself into the work.
There was one person, there was a particular businessman who complained that some of the Soho Eckstein, the character of Soho Eckstein was an anti-Semitic depiction and did the Jews of South Africa no service. And it's an interesting thing. Obviously, in terms of South Africa's history, as in many places, there was a very large representation of Jews in anti-apartheid movements. But at the same time, there were a lot of Jewish people in South Africa who did just fine out of the apartheid structure. So to pretend that everybody was an activist would be completely false. To say that no one was would also be false. But in fact, the interesting thing about this man was that he was in partnership with another man, and a few years later, his partner was in fact disbarred from the London Stock Exchange for disgraceful dealings. So there was obviously something in the image of Soho that he saw in himself that he really did.
There you go.
So then there was so that then kind of, that passed, but I understand where it came from. Yes, there's a question.
Sorry.
I mean, I think it's sometimes it can be quite disingenuous. We put the label there and then we leave the question behind. There's a beautiful statue in Mexico City of one of the Spanish kings, and it has on it a sign saying, this is a statue of king, I'm not sure which king, and there was a movement to take it down, but because of the beauty of the sculpture and because it was the first bronze sculpture ever cast in Mexico, it was decided to keep it, but this does not signify approval of the Spanish king. That was in 1911. And so by now it's got a fantastic patina and it's part of the sculpture and part of it, so it grows into it. In that one, I would say, yes, I really think that was a great solution to it. Sometimes it can be too easy to say, okay, we've got this big sculpture, we're going to keep our Confederate sculpture, we'll just put a little line saying, no, this may give offense to some people and think that you've dealt with the question.
Are you talking about Black and British, that book? Or? Black British? Oh, okay.
I'm sure that is now. Every museum, I think, is trying, or a large number are trying to, in one or another, try to work out not addressing it, but how to begin to Already, I mean, a lot of Benin bronzes have been repatriated.
Mm-hmm.
And one then thinks, oh my God, all the Benin bronzes have left Europe. In fact, there were 4,000 of them that were taken, and I think a large number have returned, but still all the museums that had them still have some, and they're there to be seen not only by people in Nigeria, but in other places. I think that's a discussion that's really beginning.
Mm-hmm.
That's for you. That's for you. That's for you.
Well, I think if I were capable of the smudging and the turns, if I could think of how to do that, I would love to do it. I do work in fragments and try to point to things through the accumulation of events, but there are other ways to do it. Mm-hmm. All the way back there, maybe?
How do you determine what materials and what mediums a different idea takes? When you have an idea, how do you kind of start that process?
Usually the material comes first, and then we see what the ideas are kind of latched on. But for example, if I'm working with a piece of theatre or opera, there always has to be a theme that I'm interested in or that suggests itself, and there has to be a medium or material in which to think about it, which may be charcoal, or it may be ink drawings which can be cut up and rearranged and become something about fragmentation and rearrangement. So the opera Lulu, for example, which is about a kind of unstable object of desire. Everybody wants Lulu to be a certain way, and she can never be the person they want, and her lovers are never the way she wants them to be. So the sense of drawing with Indian ink and then taking those drawings and cutting them up and rearranging them was both an interesting new way to work with making images with these fragmented pieces of Indian ink, but also as a way of thinking about some of the themes in the opera.
But I also love in your work that as the years have gone by, I will see a new work, and within that work is something that brings me back to something you did 20 years ago, like a disembodied head so do you consciously, or I'm maybe unconsciously, see every day the accumulation as more material?
I do. I mean, I wish there could always be new images, but I think one has to put the repetition down to a lack of imagination.
No.
And but it's true. I think what happens is that all the various objects, characters, whether they're Soho or others, or the megaphone or the rhinoceros, they're a bit like a cupboard full of commedia dell'arte characters. They're there to be brought back out to perform the next play, whatever the theme is that's being done. And some new ones come in at each time, we hope.
Yeah,
It gets
and
larger, but a lot of old ones keep coming back. I mean, I once made a list of everything I've drawn, and then another list of everything I've never drawn. I've never drawn the Lincoln Memorial. I've never drawn a hippopotamus. I've never drawn a Welsh rarebit. I've never... and I thought, I'm only going to draw things from the second list, what I haven't drawn for a while. But then found that I was kind of stuck, and I couldn't draw the first hippopotamus. Well, I didn't know why I was, but was very happy to draw the 400th rhinoceros. So sometimes there are things in those particular, where the image meets the idea, the will for drawing halfway, that one gets it. We have this. There's someone here.
Someone here? Okay.
Yeah, someone has been had for a while.
Well, all right, the secret is out. I can't see a thing.
I wanted to ask about I noticed in the charcoal drawings, the black and white, always, especially where you're smudging and redoing, the red lines. Are they markers for the cinema, or how are you using all the red lines?
So the red has two... Sorry, sorry, do you want to ask them?
How are you using the red ink?
The red lines in the drawings. They have two functions. Sometimes they're there as a kind of forensic marking on top of a photograph. You have the image, and then you have the notes about it as a red line. But in the films, they very often I'd say, all right, well, I know that we need, in its most simple form, this bird is going to fly, and it's going to take 1 second, 2 seconds, 3.5 seconds across the sheet of paper. There's going to be 86 frames. And then I'll roughly mark with the red where okay, that's the first second, there's the second, more or less at that speed. And then they're a reference for the passage of something, the movement of something, but they're also a kind of a record of time. And they kind of, so it's interesting, if you look at a film or you look at a static image and you look at it for 5 seconds, then say a landscape, a photograph, then that's your 5 seconds that you've given to the photograph, and you feel it's yours that you've given. If there's just even the most vestigial bird that's moving across the landscape, suddenly the time shifts into the film, and the film has 5 seconds in it, and not you. So there's a sense of how does one push the time into the image that some of the red lines are about, or are used for rather than they're about that.
But also, doesn't it create a depth of field? Because I feel in your work, often the freedom to layer, it's almost like memory is behind the actualizing, of what came before, what might have been under there, what is coming forward, and what is being labeled on top.
I think that's correct, but it's something in a way that the medium does itself. If you're working in other mediums, there'd be other sets of association. That's what. Here, when I see this drawing, I realize the red lines are very often also, particularly in the colonial landscapes, kind of surveyor's beacons, marking out the land that's going to then be controlled in a different way. So to say this illusion of this is pure nature is not. It's nature that's about to have a series of transformations wrought on it, imposed on it.
This clock says zeros.
They're going to explode. If this was a James Bond film, the hall would have exploded, because when it got to 59, 58, we didn't run forward and stop it.
So I want to thank everyone, and thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you.